Yes, please do. Hello, a very warm welcome to you all. Thank you for joining Global Peace Studies for Sustainable Development in Africa, where we discuss pertinent issues of peace and sustainability around the world and across Africa. I'm George Mutalema, moderating this session on behalf of the Africa Peace and Development Network, MAMA. Our theme today is Ubuntu as Radical Relationality, Reflections at a Time of Unrest. To help us discuss this theme is our guest speaker, Dr. Precious Simba. Dr. Simba is UNESCO co-chair on Intercultural Competences at Stellenbosch University in South Africa. Thank you so much, Precious, for accepting our invitation to speak to us. And I welcome everyone. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Precious Simba.
Thank you.
Dr. Precious.
Thank you so much. I join you from a site where I am teaching, actually, a professional development course for school principals here in the Western Cape in South Africa. So I hope my sound is perfect. They've managed to find a space for me to connect because it was in the middle of our day. So I just had to finish that session and jump into this one. I don't have slides to share. Is that fine? Can we just
That's fine. That's
go
fine.
ahead with, talking through my points? Is that fine?
Yes, it's fine.
Okay.
Yes, please.
All right. Okay. Hello, everybody. Thank you to George. Thank you to your team and for this invitation to our chair to come and share on notions of Ubuntu and how they relate or can relate to ideals of global peace. Now, when I was approached, I'm an Ubuntu scholar. That's my area of research and focus. It's what I wake up thinking about most mornings, besides my family. And for me, I'm always trying to find intersections of Ubuntu. Obviously, my bread and butter, my everyday is Ubuntu and education. But also Ubuntu as it relates to other aspects of our lives. At the chair, the UNESCO chair on intercultural competencies, one of the things that we are deeply concerned about is finding intersections of Ubuntu and intercultural competencies. How do we teach Ubuntu as an intercultural competence? And how do we tell those stories? How do we talk about intercultural competence from the global south? So that's what we are concerned about. So when this invitation came, it's a slight pivot from what I usually think about and write about, but still it was a very interesting topic to consider, an intersection to look at. There are many scholars that have gone before me and written about Ubuntu and peace building processes. I will not touch mostly on that. I'm just going to offer you some insights from my work on Ubuntu and why it can be a form of radical relationality and why it can be pertinent in this time that we find ourselves in, which is unsettling in this moment in our history, can be unsettling, but is not entirely new. If we are honest with ourselves, this moment is not entirely new, right? So the abstract that I sent represents my first thoughts after my conversation, my e-conversation with George, where I began to think of the global tensions that we have right now and the place that we find ourselves. We can insert Ubuntu as a framework to think through the challenges that we have as communities, as nation states, as a continent, and as a global community of nations. We can insert Ubuntu to help us to think through the tensions that we have. So it can be a radical framework for understanding relationality in this increasingly world defined by division. And the second thought that I had, even though I have my own notion of, I'm cultivating my own understanding of what Ubuntu is or can be, where I went to was a scholar called Felix Murove, who writes about Ubuntu as relationality. I've always enjoyed the alliteration, the way he plays on the wording there, but also the way that he develops the concept there. And that's where I went to contend with that given this rapidly degenerating international community of nations, and we can all agree that there is a rapid decay in the engagement of nation states, we can extend the concept relationality, but not only as what Murove calls relationality, but I think we can add a layer to it and make it radical relationality. Maybe speaking to the intensity of this moment we find ourselves in. So we can think of Ubuntu in that way. But just to expand on this idea and where I went as I was reflecting on George's invitation, I also landed on a book by Bell Hooks, the late African-American scholar, thinker, her book called Belonging, A Culture of Place. I've always enjoyed her writing, but in this particular instance, there's a quotation that captured me where she talking about place, where we belong, is a constant subject for many of us, indeed for me, and I think for some of the people in this audience. We want to know if it is possible to live on the earth peacefully. Is it possible to sustain life? Can we embrace an ethos of sustainability that is not solely about the appropriate care of the world's resources, but is also about the creation of meaning, the making of lives that we feel are worth living? And this, for me, touched deeply on what I would love to talk about. So the book, Bell Hooks' book, which was published in 2007, I think, and has many essays, some of them which are over 25 years old. And yet, as I read the essays, in leading to this talk, I found it very prophetic. I found the words dripping with prophetic providence, actually, especially in light of this neo-apocalyptic, TikTokable frenzy of a moment we sit in. All right. So, and lastly, this is all happening in me thinking, reflecting, preparing. But instead of going forward, trying to project where this life is going and where Ubuntu can take us, in light of this moment we find ourselves in, I found myself going backwards and reflected on other moments that have given me the sense that this global moment has given me. Like I said, for me, and I believe for many others, this moment, even though it is very abrasive, it is not new. So I went back to other moments that have given me this sense, right? And it took me to 3 specific moments, actually. And I would like to reflect on those moments specifically throughout my talk today as I try and put forward this idea of Ubuntu as radical relationality. The first one was the brief video that came out in a few years ago, a video of the MEC of Health, a provincial minister who was towering over a woman who was in a hospital bed, obviously a very vulnerable position, berating her on her using up resources for her, and I quote here, her a health system. And in that moment, we could all see, for many of us, it was a painful moment to witness this towering, powerful person with a very important title standing over a person in a moment of vulnerability and berating her for circumstances far beyond her control, even far beyond the MEC's control, if we are to be honest. A second moment I went back to was that tragedy in Marikana, the massacre of lone min workers, which now is Sibanye Still Waters in 2012. And the image that has become, for many of us, imprinted in our heads and hearts of the man with the green blanket. I was taken back there. Yet another abrasive moment, a moment of a sense of loss, of shared humanity. And the last one, I went back to another tragedy in Kano in Lebanon, where bodies lay scattered in a United Nations compound after bombardment by forces. And throughout this talk, like I said, I will come back to each of these and I will reflect on them and see what are the possibilities. Can Ubuntu speak to this moment? Did Ubuntu speak in those moments that I reflected on in the past? And so what is the possibility of our now and going forward? Okay. Now, for many people, Ubuntu is an African philosophy, and it is grounded in relationality. It's often invoked for many people as an ethic of care, of mutual recognition, of our connectedness as persons. The versions of Ubuntu that have become vogue of an easy process, unfortunately, a niceness that carries no moral labor, no ontological burden. These versions of Ubuntu are without history, without community, unaccountable to anyone or anything. They are an Ubuntu that seemingly births itself and bears no relational accountability. But the Ubuntu that I want to share today is not so sanitized. Okay? It is not a sanitized moral ideal. I want to speak of Ubuntu as a radical ontology, one that fundamentally challenges the fractures of our present moment and gives us a plausible future. And it might seem like a paradox to speak of moments of human failure and even Ubuntu failure, and then still speak of possibility of Ubuntu, but I will expand on that. So building on Felix Murove's 2004 articulation of Ubuntu as relationality, he refuses an easy Ubuntu, right? He refuses an Ubuntu that is about niceties. I could argue that given the context that he was writing on in his book, he speaks of Ubuntu that is deeply rooted in the cultural exchanges of Abantu, which are persons that are framed by Ubuntu. But this idea of Ubuntu that Murove and others, perhaps myself, I can try and implicate myself in that we speak of is not a very popular idea of Ubuntu, because it is an Ubuntu that has burdens. I speak of an Ubuntu that has the memories of the times when the land was held as a common good and not a commodity, for example. An Ubuntu that knows that there is no community without processes of seeing the other, processes of accepting the other. Sorry.
What is that?
Sorry about that, okay. Precious. Ferdinand, if you hear us, thank you so much. Precious, please go ahead. Sorry about that.
No problem. No problem. The Ubuntu I want to try and speak of and I try and evoke in this moment is that an Ubuntu that has deep memories, that has history, an Ubuntu that carries ideas of reparations, for example, that when there is a violation that has occurred, we cannot walk away with forgiveness alone. There has to be some forms of reparation, of payment, of repair. And this for me is an Ubuntu that is of radical relationality. This shift is necessary if we're to move beyond these domesticated, apolitical versions of Ubuntu that circulate today in corporate slogans, in state rhetoric. If we're to move toward an engagement that interrogates power, history, and lived realities of dispossession, of violations, and so forth. If we are going to have a possible future that is framed by Ubuntu, then we need to first and foremost engage with that form of Ubuntu. And to explore this possibility, I don't do it in isolation. I also turn to Jacques Derrida's notions of hostis, of hospitality, and hospitality. So bringing them all in conversation with Ubuntu. And another layer, I couldn't help myself, another conceptual layer, and also bringing the concept of ukama. Ukama is a Shona concept, Shona word concept of a kinship ethic that extends beyond the human. So through this lens, I want to consider how historical and contemporary events, the altercation at Bela Bela Hospital, the Marikana massacre, the Israeli bombarding of a UN compound, and maybe perhaps, as I had colleagues conversing just now before we started, and maybe perhaps if there is still a little bit of time, talk about the US withdrawal of aid from the Global South, to expose some contradictions and limitations of relational ethics in a world structured by power, violence, and exclusion. Okay, so that is a very long-winded introduction to say this is what I want to talk about today. I think, George, in my planning, it's possible that in the next 20 minutes, I should be done. I'm not going to take much time. So firstly, I want to talk about Ubuntu, Ukama, and the paradox of hospitality. As I've already stated, the outer tentacles of Ubuntu are far wider than has been explored academically. And many scholars have argued that Ubuntu is not just an ethic of care, but a recognition of existence in itself, of relationality. And this is where the Shona concept of Ukama, U-K-A-M-A, emphasizes the connectedness of all life, binding humans to each other, to the environment in a continuous sort of web of relation. So both Ubuntu and Ukama, which are related but not similar concepts, reject the individualistic ontology that dominates global political thought, especially in this moment, this politics of persons, of individuals, of this megalodon type of personas. It rejects that, replacing it with a framework in which belonging is always contingent upon others, upon being hospitable to others, right? But just as Derrida reminds us, all hospitality carries a paradox. To welcome is to also define the terms of welcome, is it not? So to welcome a stranger into your home is to define the terms by which the stranger can navigate their home. They are welcome in a sense, but even the stranger themselves, usually they know the limits of their welcome. So the figure of the hostess, right, the stranger who can both be guest and enemy, exemplifies this contradiction. So there are contradictions in hospitality. And in Derrida's formulation of hospitality, hospitality is never pure. It is always haunted by hospitality. By the moment when we welcome turns into exclusion, when the guest is treated as a threat, when the door that opens on one side can very well, on the other hand, become a barricade. All right. So this tension is central to how Ubuntu then functions in practice. What does Ubuntu have to say about hospitality, for example? Ubuntu a naive form of welcome, that all and anyone are welcome? Is Ubuntu an unbridled type of hospitality? And my answer is no. Ubuntu does have also, just like the forms of hospitality that Derrida talks about, it does have some standards of welcome, but not these standards of welcome is not the ones that Derrida talks about defining the terms of welcome. In Ubuntu, it is a radical openness, this realization of interconnectivity, that for one to be welcome in the midst of others, they must see the others. So a few weeks ago, I gave a talk on the concept of sawubona, which is seeing the other, where I talked about this notion. So while Ubuntu calls for radical openness, the realities of national borders, economic hierarchies, and political exclusions, as we know them now, reveal the limits of such an ethic in a world structured by hostility. So Derrida's cautions, while they are a bit removed from Ubuntu itself, they have become a familiar blanket in the bordered relations of our current world, such that to think otherwise, to think outside of this bordered life, to think outside of this life where crossing borders is so regulated, is to be accused of being utopian in your ambitions, and even maybe to be disconnected from reality. Okay. So Ubuntu, in one sense, can be taken to be utopian, but I think Ubuntu is grounded in reality. And where we see the groundedness of Ubuntu in reality is even where Ubuntu fails, that Ubuntu itself is not immune to failure. And this takes me to the first instance I want to reflect back on, where the fracturing of Ubuntu in history was demonstrated. And this was in 2012, the Marikana massacre. In August 2012, when the striking miners at the Lonmin platinum mine, which has become Sibanye Still Waters, they were demanding fair wages, dignified working conditions, and the state's response through the South African police services was brutal. 44 miners were shot dead and over 70, according to the commission documents that were later published, in what has become one of the deadliest use of force by police in post-apartheid South Africa. Why this one, I go back to this moment, is because the Marikana massacre raises an unsettling question. How does a state supposedly born from the ethos of Ubuntu turn its weapons on its people in such a brutal way? All right. I know it's an unfair ask to say, how can we demand a standard of Ubuntu from a nation? But if you remember, the nation project of South Africa hinged on not only being a rainbow nation, but was birthed out of a process of Ubuntu. And the miners' demands were not only about wages, if we remember that moment, they were about recognition. These were people, if you think about it metaphorically and substantively, who live a large part of their lives underground, unseen, doing the work that others walk on top of, literally. They wanted an assertion of dignity in a system that wanted to render them invisible. The massacre exposes a rupture in the promise of Ubuntu, a betrayal in which the state, rather than upholding the interconnectedness of its people, it violently fractured it. And here, that idea of hospitality, then, not Ubuntu, but hospitality, this hostility takes form not in only the literal denial of a home, but in the transformation of the nation state into a space of exclusion and, unfortunately, death. And so we saw in that moment the murderous genes of the former apartheid state showing their face and clearly demonstrated that they were entrenched even in the youth. I want to go again back in history to the Israeli bombing of Qana, the UN refugee compound in 1996. Now, this might seem an unfair place to demand Ubuntu, because Ubuntu might be a far removed concept from the people in that region. It's certainly not within their language history. But if you can bear with me, during that time, for people who are not familiar, what happened in April, actually, 1996, during the Israeli operation of the Grapes of Wrath, there was an artillery bombardment that struck a UN refugee compound. It has later become known that all parties involved were familiar with the location of the refugee camp and who was there, that more than 100 people ended up being killed during this event. And why I want to bring this event, even though it doesn't directly tie to the demands of Ubuntu, it forces us to confront these contradictions of hospitality and hospitality on the global stage. If you think about it, the UN compound was a space of welcome, of refuge, literally. Yet within the logic of war, even spaces of supposed refuge can be transformed into spaces of disposability. The bombing of Qana illustrates again the functioning of the reader's notion. At its most violent, the moment when the guest, the refugee, the vulnerable, is no longer seen as subject deserving protection, but as collateral damage in geopolitical calculations. Lastly, I can talk of that moment when the MEC of Health in Limpopo stood over an ailing Zimbabwean woman. This was in South Africa, who was in a hospital bed. If you've ever been in a hospital bed, that is one of the most vulnerable positions one can ever find themselves in. You are at the mercy, literally, of your carers. You're at the mercy of your attendees, those who attend to you medically. And in that moment, if we can imagine this woman who was at the mercy of her hosts. And I particularly go back to this moment because on the play of the idea of the hospital as a place of hospitality, how this was taken away from this woman by a towering figure that chose to belittle for issues that were of no concern, that the demand for care was completely ignored. So clearly, there have been moments in our history that have been abrasive to our skin, almost like this moment, this political moment that we sit in. This moment where, for example, the US is withdrawing aid from many countries, where a lot of people who were now dependent on life-saving care, antiretroviral drugs, TB care, prevention of mother-to-child transmission of HIV/AIDS, all of that was held up by this proverbial generous hand from the US state. And all of a sudden it is taken away. Somebody has written on the weaponization of abandonment. And I see that as a case that is happening. Now, colleagues, we can say, this is not a moment of Ubuntu, it's a wake-up call for Africa. Yes, maybe on one hand, but if we can, from an Ubuntu, from a preservation of life, from a standpoint of respecting the dignity of others, regardless of the position that they find themselves in, we can agree that this withdrawal of aid in such a way is not an economic decision, but a decision of indignity and a decision that is meant to berate the global south. Now, should countries in the global south do better? Should they take the charge to take care of their own? Yes, they should. However, there was a system that was already in place, and this withdrawal represents a weaponized abandonment of some sort. So in light of these failures, Ubuntu has failed. It has failed at a local, an intimate, and at a global stage. Why do I still speak of the possibility of relationality, or even a possibility of radical relationality? And what can be radical about relationality? If Ubuntu is to survive global unrest, if it is to be helpful in any way in this moment ourselves, I think, like I've already said, we must move beyond its domesticated form and reclaim its radical roots. Radical relationality means not just recognizing interdependence, but actively contesting the structures that render some lives disposable and some worth saving. It requires a politics that is not merely about inclusion, but about transformation. And I understand that in some places in America, transformation is not a favorable word. And I know for many Ubuntu scholars, and certainly for me, when we think of the possibility of this possibility, when we think of the possibilities of Ubuntu in terms of transformation, the place that we first go to is not the public space. I'm transmitted back to places dominated by pedagogies of the intimate. And what is radical about relationality is in the form of Ubuntu that does not only see the other, that does not only encounter the other from a place of strange ontology. So this idea of the stranger who requires our hospitality. It is an Ubuntu that has a language of relationality where all bodies are placed within the lineality of existence and deserving of dignity. So with those who are, this idea of Ubuntu takes those who are typically at the fringes and it deliberately brings them to the center. It is an Ubuntu that comes with the willingness, and here is the radical point. It is an Ubuntu which comes with a willingness to lose for the sake of the humanity of another. And this is where I believe we lose a lot of our business friends who would like to take Ubuntu as a brand. Because, colleagues, this form of relationality is difficult, and it is itself a form of hostess, especially to capitalist regimes that dominate what has become really our everyday. I often laugh at companies that, not in a malicious way, but that bear the brands of Africanicity or Ubuntu. I believe there's even an Ubuntu cafe, because at the very essence of the practice of Ubuntu is a willingness for loss. It is the willingness to lose on behalf of another, because without that willingness, the practice of Ubuntu is not possible. And so when I hear companies talking about Ubuntu as a brand or Africanicity, I'm shocked because loss is the very antithesis of capitalist enterprise. And so as such, Ubuntu can be fundamentally implausible for business. But I guess that's a discussion for another forum. But what of nation states? Are they capable of this unbounded and maybe unbordered relationality or this radical approach? Colleagues, as I present to you today, to be honest, I'm caught between reflecting on the beauty and tenderness of the moments and possibility of Ubuntu, as well as the difficulty of realizing these within the public sphere. So in a previous article, in a chapter actually called 3 Stories of Ubuntu, I consider this idea and I say perhaps this Ubuntu, it may not be possible, but it is plausible. One scholar writing on radical relationality in the context of archives, they say that actually a radical relationality is an opening. It is a plausibility. Not that it is possible, but it is plausible. Radical Ubuntu may ask, who determines the terms of relationality? What does it mean to enact Ubuntu in this world full of closed borders? And how do we reclaim Ubuntu from the neoliberal frameworks that seek to dilute its radical potential? And for me, this is where a possible, now looking forward, reflecting back, a possible path forward lies in the ethics of Ukama. Ukama, like I said, is a Shona concept that talks about lineality, relationality. Unlike Ubuntu, which has been co-opted into state and corporate discourses, Ukama, I believe, remains embedded in indigenous traditions that resist commodification. If Ubuntu is to become truly radical, it must align itself back again with movements of land justice, environmental sovereignty, of decolonization. It must align itself again with practices within the indigenous. Spaces where relationality is not merely a theoretical idea, but a lived struggle. And I emphasize that word, struggle. As Bell Hooks writes in this book that I started off with on belonging, she notes that for many of these essays, so the essays that are in the book, in this book, focus on issues of land and land ownership. So in a book that speaks about belonging, about access, the one thing that she goes back to again and again is land and land ownership. So to speak about Ubuntu, about Ukama, about radical relationality, even though we're starting in intimate pedagogies, those private spaces, our grandmother's hands, our mother's tutelage, and so forth, we cannot but end in places in the public, land, belonging, land ownership, things that should ideally be held in commons. We can say the same about the crises that plague us right now, from issues in America, Greenland, Canada, Ukraine, Crimea, issues in Central African Republic, DRC, Zimbabwe, South Africa. These are issues that come back down to ideas of belonging, of land, borders, and who gets to relate with what border in which way. So these issues are, if I read Hooks perceptively, about belonging, of space, of being, and being in space, and who has the right to sit with it. Maybe as I come to an end. Colleagues, the fractures in our world are undeniable, especially in this global world that seems near apocalyptic. Yet Ubuntu, an indigenous practice of Ukama, calls us to resist this fragmentation, not through naive optimism, not through naive niceties, not through an unbounded form of forgiveness and interrelation, but through radical commitment to relationality as struggle. It is not easy, but as Toni Morrison reminds us, the function of freedom is to free someone else. And that function is never an easy one. So Ubuntu's function then is to extend relationality beyond comfort to the spaces of discomfort, to the spaces of dispossession and exclusion, where the work of justice must be done. So maybe to end, I will answer George's question on the idea of global Ubuntu and global peace. I think you can see that I do not have a single answer to say, is Ubuntu, is it possible, is it not? But I can certainly say it is plausible. The question is not whether Ubuntu can survive this global unrest or if it can solve this global unrest. I think the question, colleagues, is whether we have the courage to enact it in its most radical form and find what lies on the other side of that action, I believe. Thank you.
Wow. Thank you. Thank you so much indeed, Precious, for this wonderful presentation. And yes, a lot has been said, and we need to take that in very, very, maybe slowly, but great ideas that have been pointed out, the unbounded relationship, this willingness to lose for the good of others, and many others. So I think we're going to be quoting lots of, sentences, a lot of wise sayings from you. Thank you so much indeed, Precious. And now it's time for questions and comments from our colleagues and everybody who is here today. You are all welcome. And we are discussing Ubuntu as a radical relationality. That's quite new to some of us. Reflections at a time of unrest. Let's begin with Evelyn. You are welcome, Evelyn.
I am, as always, overawed by the wisdom and, in this case, the wisdom cloaked in poetry. It was not just insightful, but beautiful. And I love your name because your name embodies, I believe, what you're talking about with radical Ubuntu, in that your name is Precious and Simba, the lioness. So you embody the elements of radicalism. I think that's wonderful. And above all, I thank you for the linking of Ubuntu and Ukama, because in the past discussions, my perennial question has been, how do we go beyond the immediate kinship roots of Ubuntu to engage in relations that respect all life and, as you say, all relationships with that which allows life to be. So I'm sorry, I've just taken up this space to say a big thank you.
Thank you.
Or perhaps, well, no, I won't take more time. Thank you.
That's all right, Evelyn. That's all right. You can always talk to us for sure. Thank you indeed. Jean, Chris, please unmute your microphone.
Oh, yes. Dr. Simba, thank you so very much for the way you brought the relational dimension of Ubuntu and expanded on that. And I just posted the publication by Desmond Tutu, No Future Without Forgiveness. He also expounds Ubuntu quite clearly, how it is not just something we have, but it is our being. A person with Ubuntu says is a person who's kind. And he speaks also about forgiveness. He says anger, resentment, lust for revenge, even success, thought, aggression are against Ubuntu. And we can also link Ubuntu with Ujamaa as it transpires in your thought, because Julius Nyerere was speaking about Ujamaa in the sense that there is a global brotherhood and sisterhood. So our brothers, our sisters are not only people we were born with, our siblings, but they are every human being, no matter where the person comes from, no matter what the person looks like. But a human being is a brother to me, is a sister to me, beyond the boundaries of our blood relationship. And I found something quite interesting you mentioned during the uprising in South Africa, the treatment of mine workers. And if you see the ordeal those people have experienced, you ask yourselves, where is Ubuntu in South Africa? And as you said, it is not just a matter of a wage, but the recognition that they are human beings. They work in such inhumane conditions when they are underground. And the conditions in which they work follow them even when they are outside on the surface. And where is Ubuntu? And that's where we see the clash between Ubuntu and Capitalism, where the exploitation of natural resources takes away that respect for human dignity. I've posted there, I would like to have your email because of work I'm doing on Ubuntu and climate change. The relationship we have as humans, how can those relationships, that relationship be extended into the way that we take care of our environment, human stewardship of the environment. And thank you so much. I would have said much more, but let me not deprive others of the opportunity to share their thoughts. Well done, and I will look forward to engaging with you again. Thank you.
Thank you. Let's turn to Fred and Richard, and then Precious, you may say something about that. And of course, Eliseo. Fred, please, you're welcome. Nice to see you again.
Thank you, George. Thank you, Prof. And hi, everyone. Let me echo or reiterate the gratitude for this very good presentation. I was actually taking notes relating to what we discussed last time. And I have a couple of questions, not question to the presenter, to Prof, but I think question of reflection to us all here in this forum. The first one, just speaking from where Dr. Kiala just mentioned, I'm asking myself, where did we go wrong with our Ubuntu? And I'm not talking about only South Africa, not only the mining, and we remember a few years back, we had the issue of South Africa chasing people from other countries, African countries. And there was a reflection that time that was like ignoring what South Africa went through and how other African countries, including Nigeria, actually, Nigeria passing even a law to support South Africa, given South African passports. I think that's a question that we are asking. My second thought is like, what is making us lose our Ubuntu? Because it seems that we are just fighting. There are enough resources, and I know if I put my religious faith, the late Pope John Paul II said that if the world is suffering today, it's not that because we don't have enough resources, but it is because of lack of solidarity, because we are actually producing more, and the more we are producing is only controlled by a few people, I think that's a reflection that we need to put. And I can link this up to Prof. What you raised, the issue of the suspension or I think discontinuity of the US aid. And we are just looking into this. And again, there was a reflection when I was working for, I was a consultant with Oxfam, and there was an Italian lady who actually brought a good reflection. Who is creating the mess in the world? And why is it the same group that's creating the mess in the world, which is actually the one giving more resources? So where are we? Are we on the side of the perpetrators of the mess, or on the side of relief? And what is beyond the relief that we are working? My last point for reflection is, where are we going from here? And I'm talking about especially these countries that we have mentioned who are really suffering. I think how can we use the relationship through Ubuntu, the consciousness that is coming through it, but also the resources that we have to really, I'm a scout, by the way, and in a scout, our motto is creating a better place for all. So that's where I'm looking into how can this notion of Ubuntu actually help us to create a better world for all of us, and also to leave the world a better place than we found it. Thank you.
Thank you so much indeed, Fred. So, Richard?
Thank you so much for counting me in. And good afternoon from Ghana. I'm very happy about Dr. Simba's presentation. So I want to answer this. I think US aid is an aspect of Ubuntu, maybe termed in other culture, termed in other culture. But back then, when US aid was active, what reciprocative effects were made onto those aiders, those who were giving the aid? At least Ubuntu, you gave, I gave. You are because I am. What us as we are, or as they are, or as we are, what were they? Or what do we give in return to the aid, what is it, Africa receive, or maybe global, maybe not Africa alone. People were on aid. What are we also?
I can see that there's a problem of the connection with Richard there, but I would like to ask Precious if you could just respond to a few remarks, and then we'll turn to Eliseo and Dala. Thank you both for joining us again. Precious, please.
Yes. Yeah, thank you, colleagues, for your reflections and questions and excitement. I always tell people that when I talk about Ubuntu, for a lot of people that are familiar with the concept, they get excited because to speak about Ubuntu is to touch on something deeply intimate because of where we first learned peculiarities of Ubuntu. So for me, when I start touching on Ubuntu, for many people, it takes you there. So I can see the excitement in the colleagues here. But also it's to speak to the sacredness of the person, okay? And humanity. One Zimbabwean scholar even speaks of it. It is to touch on the very soul of a person, but I'm not sure if we can go there. Maybe it takes us into more theological terrain. But to respond to you, colleagues, yes, I have engaged with Bishop Tutu's notions of Ubuntu. If we are honest with ourselves, I think at a scholarly level, one of the first people to bring good scholarly work around Ubuntu, of course, we can speak of the Samkanges in Zimbabwe, we can speak of Ramose in South Africa, but also Bishop Tutu did a lot to bring Ubuntu into the academic domain and gave us nuggets to work off on to begin to imagine worlds that are framed by Ubuntu. Whether you agree or don't with the process of the TRC, but it was quite visionary, the work that he did in trying to imagine a nation that can be thought otherwise. Perhaps the folly of us, and maybe that speaks to Fred's question to say what went wrong, is we stopped imagining. We stopped imagining possibilities of Ubuntu at points of failure. We stopped imagining and critiquing ourselves to take up and say, did we fall short? In a conversation with a colleague, we launched a book a few weeks ago at the Desmond and Leah Tutu Foundation, actually. And we were just talking with Janet Jobson, who is the CEO there, and comparing notes to say, for example, the TRC, which first gave us Ubuntu as a nation building concept, only lasted for 3 years. All of that, all thousands of interviews, was only 3 years. But later on, for some of you who are familiar with the State Capture Commission that happened in South Africa a few years ago, that lasted 5 years. So you can see that there were constraints that Tutu and the commissioners had, but still they were willing to envision not even just possibilities, but plausibilities. What can Ubuntu do for us? Even though it's not perfect, we can start the journey of crafting an alternative outlook for ourselves. But perhaps where we fell, Fred, was we stopped imagining. We stopped that process of imagining, of considering possibilities. Even after Marikana, I believe there was a moment to deeply reflect and say, where have we faltered and how can we reimagine? Yeah, but there's more I can say about that, but I think I will end it there. Yeah, if there are colleagues who want to share more, I've shared my email. Please feel free. We can continue the conversation, as well as our chair. A few weeks ago, I gave a talk on another notion of Ubuntu, Sawubona, seeing the other. That is available on our page, and my colleague Dala, Professor Diedov, has shared the link to that, so we can. And then on the notion of Ujamaa and Ubuntu, there are so many similarities there. Somebody gave me a new one from Nigeria. Now the term has left me. But there are many such concepts throughout African life worlds that we can find similarity, resonance with Ubuntu, and Ujamaa is one such notion. And also the courage of the original Pan-Africanists to begin to take these concepts from the private space and try imagine a better future for African people. And I believe within our politics, maybe that is our folly, we have stopped this process of building on these concepts because I think personalities can only take us so far, but it is up to those who live in the moment to take the work and carry it forward. So take the work of Ujamaa and carry it forward. How can we imagine Ujamaa, for example, in this moment of climate crisis? Can we use Ujamaa to begin to think about a differently connected world? I think those are the things that we should be taking forward and trying to reimagine the concepts. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you so much. So Eliseo and Dala, and then we go to Jean Chris. Eliseo, please. Welcome from Mozambique.
Thank you very much, Dr. George. And I would like also to thank Precious, for the wonderful presentation. I have, first of all, a share of my point of view of Ubuntu. Then I may pose a question. My sharing goes this way. I have loved the way Precious has elaborated the topic, Ubuntu as relationality, and it is indeed. And also, I think the presenters, or those who have shared in this talk, have mentioned a lot of similarities with the other African ways of thought, like it was done by Desmond Tutu and Mandela in South Africa. And we have said of Ujamaa in Tanzania with Julius Nyerere. And also, I remember the concept of Harambee by Jomo Kenyatta in Kenya, the concept of Nyayo philosophy by Daniel Arap Moi in Kenya. And also we have the similar point of view in Mozambique with Samora Machel by his socialism. Now, being at Rent season as Catholics, I also started to, when Precious was presenting, I went through thinking on if we cannot also talk of Jesus Christ as a best example of Ubuntu by sharing solidarity and cooperation with humanity, and bringing to the human beings the God, the holy side of the being. But all of these are pointing to the Ubuntu as a philosophy of life, wisdom of being with others. Just as Ramon puts it, I am because you are. And when I look at Africa, now I start becoming a little bit afraid, because I question myself and I don't find the answers on why we call Africa the Ubuntu continent, which I think, in my belief, it was supposed to call each person, every African, to be a champion of hope, where hope is lacking. However, when it comes to Africa, we see those in power, whether economic or political power, which are almost the same people, they fail to speak the truth to power when it comes to addressing the suffering of those on the margins. And yet we say this is the Ubuntu continent. As an example, even if we cannot provide for those who are poor, who are suffering, those we call capitalists or individualists, they give aid to Africa. But nevertheless, aid goes straight to the intended recipients. Aid is often misdirected. So I come to ask myself, even if you see Precious in Zimbabwe, the Shona, another example, how much of Ubuntu they are not British. You find everyone is in his corner and doing his business. And how many times do they gather for community, for So I ask, if I may ask, how can we ensure that Ubuntu becomes a true embodiment of our shared humanity in Africa? I don't know if you, Precious, you heard that question.
Yeah.
How can we ensure that Ubuntu becomes a true embodiment of our shared humanity in Africa? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dana, and then Chris.
Yes, just wanted to say hello to all of you and to thank my colleague Precious so much for for her wonderful presentation today, and to George for having our chair back again. We're just so grateful to you and to this network. And I wanted to let you know, Precious mentioned the talk that she gave for our inaugural webinar series in February. It's a monthly webinar series. And you all can, I would encourage you to listen to her talk there. It was wonderful also. And you can find that on our chair website. And we invite nominations for speakers. So if any of you all would like to be part of that series, we would welcome hearing from you. I also posted some links to, we now have our call for proposals for our conference coming up in Morocco later this year, and that deadline is May 1st, so we would love to hear from all of you as well on that. And there's a virtual conference coming up from one of our partners on a similar topic to what we've been talking about today, on our shared humanity, and that's coming up later this month, and would welcome participation in that as well. So lots of those resources are in chat, and Precious put her email there, and also put our chair email there. So we would love to hear from all of you. And again, just huge gratitude to Precious and to all of you for this wonderful, hopeful discussion, a much needed discussion today. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Darla. That's really wonderful. Thank you. Chris, please unmute.
Oh, yes. Thank you, Fred. Thank you, Dara. Thank you again, Norbert. I think it's Norbert who spoke before Dala. Yeah, I'll just, yes, as Fred was asking, where did we go wrong? And I think we have to engage more and more, even allow our thoughts to be aired on various broadcasting platforms, because we spoke about very substantive issues that could change our continent, but unfortunately we have only a few people who hear what we are talking about. And going back to Fred's question, and also to what Norbert has said, first of all, I'll say we look at Africa, pre-colonial Africa and post-colonial Africa. In pre-colonial Africa, Africans were bound by social ethos. We spoke about the values of solidarity, sharing, and sanctity of life, as Precious spoke about. But now we see more and more the erosion of African social ethos, social values, like the values of Ujamaa, Bisoiti in Congo with Professor Chamale Ngantumba, that we are one. You are because I am. We have Ubuntu, we have African communitarian views, how community exists and doesn't without each other. And then this has led to the social ills that we experience today. We have xenophobia, we have genocide, we have ethnic cleansing, we have tribalism, we have African intrastate wars. And why all this social evil? Is it because of globalization? Is it because of capitalism? People want to earn, and to earn they have to exploit. What would Africa have been without that openness to the outside world? I think the problem is ourselves, our mindset, which is being framed according to our personal individualistic interests that have made us forget about our social ethos, our African values. We don't have to blame our opening up to the world and the world visiting us and we visiting the world, but I think it's a problem of a reform that we need as Africans, and embark more Africans and put our African social ethos in our educational programs from primary school, secondary school to university. We have to refund our society based on those traditional cultural values that founded African social ethos. And if we start there, I think we would be able to change the continent, and we would look better. Not Africa of a civil war, Africa of exploitation of miners, Africa of exploitation of mineral resources, but we become a grown-up continent where we take care of ourselves and we teach our children, we teach ourselves to look after each other and not using our own political ambition to tear apart our social fabric and make Africa look like a terrible continent. We are not a terrible continent. We are a beautiful continent with beautiful resources, and we shouldn't allow our resources to become a curse. And we shouldn't be beggars, Africans. We have a lot of resources, a lot of wealth. We can even help the United States. We can help Ukraine. We can help other countries in the world if we really discipline ourselves and manage our resources and have good governance and have transparent system of possession of power. I think we will look more attractive as a continent than the pitiful image that we are giving to the world today. And this is my little contribution to the beautiful presentation that Precious has given us. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Precious, if you could respond to those questions and comments and then return to Norbert. And I would like to ask, for an English equivalent of Ubuntu, maybe in Vermont or Canada, you've got a word for Ubuntu. For me, I tried this as humanness, that quality which makes us human beings. Yeah. So anyway, Precious, please go ahead, and then Norbert, get prepared, please.
I think a lot of the colleagues are giving comments, and all of them, they're very valuable. Thank you. Also learning a lot from different parts of Africa. Jean, you might have to come back again with that concept from, maybe write it down for us, from the Congo. That was a new one for me, and it will be good for us to learn these concepts, terms, and pass them on. So I do agree, and I guess what Jean is talking about is exactly what Elios was asking. How do we ensure the continuity of these concepts? For me, number one is imagination, especially at a political scale. I think the crime in Africa is a lack of imagination at a political scale. A lot of the times we are led by people with no imagination, especially concerning the upliftment of African people. What I tend to go back to is the work that the original Pan-Africanists did to reimagine the life of a decolonized Africa. And for them, if we take it warts and all, I know they were not perfect people, but they had embers of a vision of where we wanted to go as a people. And the vision was for Africa, not for individual states, not for individual tribes, not for individual places. They had vision for Africa. I think we need to go back to that. And then secondly, certainly the idea of teaching Ubuntu. Right now, one of the projects that I am engaged in at my university, Stellenbosch University, where I'm planted in the Faculty of Education, is we're doing a research where we say we're teaching teachers Ubuntu. What are we teaching them? Are we teaching them to teach in an Ubuntu way? Are we teaching them to be carriers of Ubuntu? How do they then, for them, how do they pass it on? So that's what we are engaged in right now. For initial teacher training programs, coming up with a curriculum of Ubuntu where we can pass it on to teachers. Because if there is a change that we want to bring to society that is wide, that is deep, that is long lasting, certainly we need to plant it within our schools. And for us, that's where we are starting with our project. And certainly we would love to see this project transplanted into other places as well, and see how then these pedagogies, we call them humanizing pedagogies, then transmute and take on different forms in different countries, because the concepts there might not be an Ubuntu that looks the same. So another colleague from Malawi was shared a concept, a term, an aphorism to say kalikoga kanyama tili wawili tiwantu, and that tiwantu speaks to that idea of Ubuntu. If you're alone, all prey, kanyama, you'll be eaten, right? But tili wawili, once we come together, again, ideas of solidarity, there is a sense of our humanity being realized. So in every place, the seeds are there, the concepts are there. We need to cultivate them and find ways to use them imaginatively. And I think platforms such as these, George, are helpful, but also passing them on in ways that the next generation can also carry forward, and making sure that they do not die out. The indictment by Jean, yes, we have allowed ourselves to be taken up by this atomistic, individualistic urban lifestyles. But even there are societies. There's a colleague that I've engaged with from Japan, for example, where even as their society was becoming more industrialized, they carried with them the seeds of their traditional values to foster this interconnected society. And it has helped them in various ways. So it's possible. There are possibilities there. Again, we have to come back to our imagination. How can we reimagine these concepts? Obviously, another thing that I engage in is a critique of Ubuntu. We cannot take it wholesale. There are parts of Ubuntu that we may need to leave behind, may need to transform. So to do a critique of African livelihoods, of aspects of our culture, is not to say we want to throw out the baby with the bathwater. It is just to say, as we know, as most scholars know, critique is a part of transformation. If we cannot critique ourselves, then how do we transform? So that's what I would say in response to that. But thank you. I think the responses given are fabulous.
Thanks. Norbert, please, you've been waiting. Thank you.
Thank you, George, and thank you very much, Madam Presenter, Dr. Simba. You also have Simba here in Tanzania.
Yes.
I just have...
And it means lion as well.
Yes. I just have a small contribution to this. There have been a debate on why we let Ubuntu get lost. I will start from there. In Africa, and this is very sad, we do not write our cultures, and we do not own what works better for us. As far as Ubuntu is concerned, one cannot take Ubuntu in isolation from history. So when we look at our pre-colonial cultures, our culture was built on 5 pillars: humanness, peace, trust, hospitality, and integrating the diverse culture as oneness. So I was reading Mwalimu Julius Kambarage Nyerere philosophy on ujamaa and socialism, that oneness for our integrity. And this, it has come to a question currently: who is willing to lose? Our founders, our ancestors were willing to lose. At one time, Nyerere said, Tanzania is not independent if other countries are not independent too. So he was ready to lose. And I remember we also participated in securing freedom and independence to other countries. So those founders were ready and committed and willing to lose. But today, in the global geopolitics, who is willing to lose? That's where the problem starts. No one is ready to lose. And as a result, we are finding that we cannot integrate what we think it works better for us. My profession is on natural resources. And now we are seeing natural resource as a curse. But if we would have Ubuntu, the humanness, the hospitality to take care of our resources for the betterment of ours, we could have gone far. But this, we have subjected it to others who do not even integrate this kind of issues. So I had one question in mind, that how can Ubuntu be grounded in the current global geopolitics? How can we ground Ubuntu to take care of the ongoing global issues? For instance, we can just see here, very close neighbor to us in DRC. So DRC is ready to forego the resources for peace. And also is interested to setting out with the US to exchange peace for the resources. So to me, I would think that where we went also wrong is because of our hospitality. Because during colonialism, we were also trained to forego what was better for us. We were trained to forego our culture. And as I talked to my grandmother today, he said, our hospitality is what costed us. Because we integrate, we invite guests, but at the end of the day, we accept what was brought by them and forego what we had. So that's where we are in trouble. So to me, these are my few remarks, but I'm saying we need to look at pre-colonial times, during colonial times, and post-colonial times, so as to have a tool that will sail us in this changing global landscape. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. And you may respond to that, Precious. Evelyn, you wanted to say something, but you didn't complete that idea. So you have the chance, of course, to do so. And Precious, you may also say something now.
Okay.
In response to Norbert's comment?
Yes.
Question.
Yes. Thank you, Norbert, for that. And yes, in Kiswahili, Simba is a lion, my surname. And I always have good laughs when I meet friends and family and colleagues from East Africa. In response to this idea of losing, and thank you for taking it up and connecting it to the Pan-Africanists. But when you come now to saying perhaps we were too hospitable to the colonizer, maybe, and so the African has been taken advantage of over and over again, perhaps. It's an argument that I know Professor Bernard Matolino and Wenceslaus Kundingu in a famous article titled The End of Ubuntu, they engage with it. They say perhaps we should allow this Ubuntu thing to die because it makes African people naive and open to anything and everyone, perhaps. My response to that would be that this Ubuntu that has no accountability, yes, is very naive. But there is an Ubuntu that carries with it accountability. You see, once one person shows that they operate according to a particular system that does not respect solidarity, that does not respect community, we have a paradoxical statement that people would say in many Nguni languages to say, this person is not a person, which is very paradoxical. They'd say, this person is not a person. This person is not a person, which is to say they recognize when one is willing to take themselves out of the community of communal relations. And by that action, what one does is to tarnish their own humanity. And now there is need for either to enact ways to recover their humanity, or we'll deal with them in the sense of the animalistic nature that they are. So we're not completely naive people, you see. So for example, where a perpetrator, there's another article by a South African scholar called Ankie Krok, and she was reflecting on the TRC process. The article, I think it's something like, if it means he gets his humanity back. In that article, Ankie, she reflects on one of the mothers in the TRC, South African TRC process, whose sons had been killed by the apartheid regime. And one of the killers came to ask for forgiveness. Now, this woman did not naively offer her forgiveness. Firstly, she demanded for us to recover, to help you recover your humanity. So she realized that this person, by the action that they have done, they have grossly tarnished their own humanity. They are a tarnished human being. Now, if we think about it right now in the sense of global geopolitics, what can we say about the actions of certain powerful people and their sense of humanity? But then I'll leave it there. And then this mother then goes on to say, he needs to tell the truth. If at all we are going to recover and help him recover his humanity, he needs to live in a certain way. But also, if he is to become human again, we are willing to forgive him. That's that shedding, that losing. We're willing to forgive him. Forgiveness is a form of loss. We're willing to let go of our pain and hatred. only because to restore his humanity. And for me, that is not naivety. That is a huge sense of power, but not power in the sense that we are used to, which is power over and power that is domineering, but power that literally can save a life. So I think there are dimensions of this that we can try and engage in. And this is where I disagreed with Matolin and Quindingwi's article, by the way, to say the end of Ubuntu. I think we can critique Ubuntu and say that pure form of Ujamaa, of Harambe, of Ubuntu, as we know in agrarian societies, perhaps may not fully fit urban life. That's fine. What aspects do we need to change and reimagine? And we can do that. Because after all, culture is dynamic. So we cannot hold on to an idea of Africanness that is unchanging. We can critique, we can change, and still remain relevant with our culture. So it's just a thought. It's just a thought.
Excellent. Thank you so much indeed. Would you like to say something, Evelyn, just before we close?
The only thing I would say is perhaps we could replace the reference to Mwalimu's socialism with African socialism, which I think was a very amazing contribution. And I mean, that he used the label African socialism. And I throw out, just for consideration, that we might talk about Ubukama, so that we combine Ubuntu and also the wonderful other traditions, and maybe as a base for renewing both in the current context. Thank you very much. I have another meeting, so unfortunately, sadly, I have to leave. Thank you.
Thank you so much indeed, Evelyn. I've got now Odo Chipido. You are welcome. This will be the last person to ask or make a comment for today. Odo.
Thank you, George. And thank you very much, Simba, for the delivery. I've learned a lot from what you said. In fact, you have made me look at my own presentation, which I delivered about 2-3 weeks ago. You have revealed that together we will be able to maybe put our own philosophy or ways of looking at life that may help guide the politicians and other people of this continent to take us to better places than what has happened so far. I would like to encourage, I cannot put this burden on you. I would like to encourage all of us to actually begin contributing to this concept. And perhaps we will be working together. It is not necessarily the number. I know we are few, but you see, good things sometimes have their own ways of making their own lives without having to have so many people at the same time. I also agree with what you propose in terms of a critique of Ubuntu. I agree with you based on the philosophy that the beautiful one has a smelly nose, meaning for every good thing, there's a part of it which is not so good. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Odoch. And now, as we are closing, we are going to ask Precious to make a final remark, and then we will close for today and then join again next week. So Precious, please.
I think for me, my final remark is one of gratitude, George. I'm very grateful to be welcomed into this very scholarly community, and I hope I'll be added to the mailing list so that I get future webinar invitations. And to connect in this way, colleagues, is I think very necessary so that we share, we popularize, we learn. And even though I was presenting, I think I come out of this with so much more. I've learned, so Jean has already sent me an email. I saw it come through. I've already learned concepts that I can begin to interrogate. And what more can I ask for to end a formal working day? So thank you, everyone. And I look forward to engaging further.
Thank you so much indeed, Precious. And we are looking forward to engaging with you again, and of course with your chair. We thank you also for inviting others to join us. So you are all welcome again, and thank you for your presence, and take care. Bye-bye.
Bye.